My daughter-in-law told the nurse, "Let her rot, she has no one." I was paralyzed, silent, and watching from the hospital bed. Chloe thought I couldn't fight back. She forgot I was a legal secretary for 42 years. 3 weeks later, I had her evicted, with witnesses, cameras, and court orders. Now she's locked out of my house, and I don't even need to raise my voice. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The beeping was faint, but constant. A soft metronome of survival that pulsed somewhere behind Helen's right ear. White walls blurred into beige tile, the antiseptic tang of the hospital air catching just enough in her throat to remind her, yes, she was still alive. She couldn't move much. Not yet. The stroke had left her left side clumsy, dull, unfamiliar. Her mouth twitched when she tried to speak. The muscles in her fingers didn't quite remember their old choreography. But her mind? Her mind was untouched. Still sharp, still watching, still listening. The door to her hospital room was cracked open, just wide enough. She heard footsteps, high heels, confident, expensive, then a voice, brittle and sweet like poisoned honey. "She's not going to get better," Chloe said, speaking to someone just outside. "Let her rot. She has no one." There was silence. Just a half second of it, but it cracked like thunder in Helen's chest. Amber, the nurse, new, young, still learning the rhythm of IVs and human grief, stood frozen in the hallway, chart in hand. Her head turned slightly, just enough for her gaze to meet Helen's through the narrow slice of open door. Something passed between them. Not pity, not yet, but recognition. Helen didn't blink. She didn't move. She memorized. Time, 3:46 p.m. Date, Tuesday. Tone, dismissive, certain, and rehearsed. Like it wasn't the first time Chloe had buried her alive. The sound of a bag unzipping, the soft rustle of silk. Then Chloe entered the room with a cheerful smile and a scarf that didn't belong to her. Not Helen's, but one of the good ones. Eggshell blue, worn like a trophy around her neck. "Oh, Helen," she crooned, placing a too-cold hand on Helen's shoulder. "You look so much better today." Helen's gaze didn't leave her face. Her body didn't respond, but inside, something ancient began to stir. Not rage, not yet. Something colder, heavier, strategic. Chloe busied herself arranging lilies in a vase. They were cheap, grocery store flowers, half wilted. "You know," Chloe said with a sigh, smoothing her skirt, "the house is so quiet without you. I've been keeping it up, of course. Mark's trying, bless his heart, but really, it's too much for us." Amber stepped inside the room. "Her vitals are stable," she said quietly. She didn't look at Chloe. "Well, thank God for that," Chloe said, clapping her hands lightly. "I told the social worker we'd manage her care in home if things turned around, and clearly they have." Helen let her eyes drift to Amber. "Just a second. Just long enough." Amber nodded once, barely visible, but it was an answer. Chloe leaned down again, too close. Perfume and control. "Don't you worry, Helen," she whispered. "We've got everything under control." Helen closed her eyes briefly, a flicker, just to replay Chloe's words again in her head. Let her rot. She has no one. Her left hand didn't work yet. But her right one? It twitched slightly beneath the blanket. It remembered what a pen felt like. Amber reached for the chart. "You'll want to rest now," she said softly. "Let me dim the lights." As Chloe turned to leave, Helen heard her humming under her breath, the same tune she always used when she thought she'd won. Amber gently closed the door behind her. Helen stared up at the ceiling, quiet, awake, alive, and planning the first move of her last fight. A legal secretary for 42 years. She'd taken down men who thought they were gods. She'd rewritten contracts from memory. She'd buried secrets for others. But this betrayal wasn't abstract. It was domestic. And now, it was personal. The hallway outside crackled with a pager. Amber's voice was soft but clear. "I need to make a call," she said to the nurse's station. "It's urgent." Helen didn't smile. Couldn't. But inside, something shifted. A single thought rising like a judge's gavel. You should have let me die, Chloe, because now I'm coming back. And not alone! It was well past midnight when Amber returned. The floor was quieter now, lights dimmed to a golden hum. Machines murmured their private conversations with the bodies they watched over. Helen hadn't slept. Her eyes were open, alert, locked on the strip of ceiling where a water stain curved like a faded question mark. She had tracked the hours by shifts and silence, waiting, calculating. Amber eased the door open, then shut it behind her with a soft click. She carried a black hospital tablet tucked under one arm, and in the other hand a phone. Not her own, not hospital property either. An old flip phone, still warm from the charger, prepaid, disposable, untraceable. She approached Helen's bed without speaking. There was no need. The room already held a shared current, thick, quiet, electric. Amber pressed the button and dialed. Then, without a word, she placed the phone gently in Helen's good hand and supported it with her own. One ring, two. "Garvey," came a voice, dry as old paper but iron underneath. "Still with us, huh?" Helen blinked once. Amber's voice was soft, firm. "She says yes." There was a pause, then a shift, a lawyer's silence, the kind that measures consequences before it moves. "Well," Samuel Kerr said, "that's all I need to know." Helen closed her eyes for a beat, steadying her breath. The right corner of her mouth twitched, almost a smile. Amber leaned in, lowering her voice. "She needs a reset, legal, financial, private." Another pause, then low and sharp. "Tell her I'll be there at 9 a.m. And I don't knock anymore." Click. The call ended. Amber retrieved the phone and slipped it back into her scrubs. "Sleep if you can," she whispered. But Helen was already thinking through the next morning. Bullet points, documents, witnesses, the muscle memory of litigation stretching somewhere deep in her bones. When she finally closed her eyes, it wasn't from exhaustion. It was the calm of a woman who had just made her first move and knew exactly who was playing on her team. The next morning smelled like industrial coffee and fresh betrayal. Samuel Kerr arrived precisely on time, the elevator chime still echoing when his shoes struck the tile. He moved slowly, like a man who'd earned the right to take his time. His briefcase was worn at the edges, monogrammed, heavy with what mattered. Amber met him at the nurse's station. "She's in room 3B. "I remember," he said. His voice held no nostalgia. When he entered the room, Helen turned her head to him. Just that. No smile, no theatrics, but her eyes gleamed with something new. Control. "Well," he said, settling beside her, "you always did know when to call in the big guns." Amber stood to the side, arms crossed, guarding the door. Samuel unlatched the briefcase with a sound like a judge's gavel. "Let's begin." He spread out 3 files. Helen glanced down, then back up. Blink. "Yes, I thought so," Samuel said, flipping pages with care. "Chloe's been accessing your shared family account. Multiple withdrawals marked maintenance, renovation, personalized care. Interesting euphemisms for stealing." Amber stepped forward and handed him a neatly typed page. Her signature was at the bottom, alongside a time-stamped photo of the locked pantry door and an itemized list of what Helen had been denied. "She's good," Samuel muttered, eyes scanning the document. "But not smart enough." He looked over at Helen, and for the first time his mouth curved upward. "You picked the right ally." Helen didn't blink this time. She simply stared at him, long enough to speak volumes. Samuel closed the file. "We'll need 3 more days. Maybe 4. But when this drops, she's going to wish you'd stayed silent." Outside the window, rain began to fall. Slow, steady, cleansing. Inside, Amber's phone vibrated. She checked it, frowned slightly, then turned it toward Helen. A message from Chloe. "Discharge papers coming early, hope you're ready." Helen read it once. Then, without taking her eyes off the screen, she reached for the pen Samuel had set on the tray beside her. Her fingers closed around it. Slow, shaky, but steady. The house didn't smell like home anymore. Helen had expected it, prepared herself even, but the moment she crossed the threshold, something inside her contracted. It wasn't the dust or the faint trace of cheap lavender detergent, it was the feeling, the shift, like she was no longer returning but entering foreign territory. Her own home, now held hostage. Amber wheeled her in carefully, keeping one hand on the chair and the other tight around the handle of her satchel. Chloe appeared instantly, like a hostess at a hotel she didn't own. "There we go," she chirped, voice dipped in syrup. "Let's get you upstairs. That level's more comfortable. Less in the way." Helen raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Her silence, once mistaken for weakness, had become a weapon. Amber pushed her forward. "Stairs?" No, Chloe said too quickly. "The lift's operational again. Mark fixed it himself." Helen didn't believe that for a second. Upstairs, the room Chloe had prepared was spare. A bed, a dresser, a chair with stiff cushions. The view of the garden was gone, replaced by the side yard and the neighbor's rusting shed. The curtains were floral in the way fake things always are. "You'll love it up here," Chloe said, fluffing a pillow unnecessarily. "Quieter. Fewer distractions." Amber glanced around the room like she was scanning a crime scene. "Where's the call bell?" Chloe blinked. "Oh, I didn't think she'd need one." Helen's eyes narrowed slightly. Later, after Chloe floated off to prepare lunch, Helen wheeled herself to the landing. The scent of roasted vegetables drifted faintly upward, but nothing fresh, nothing she recognized. She pointed toward the stairs. Amber nodded. Together, slowly, they descended to the main floor. What used to be Helen's kitchen, the heart of the house with its cast-iron pans and sun-warmed tiles, had been gutted. Gleaming quartz now lined the counters, cold and soulless. Her spice rack was gone, her tea tins replaced with plastic-lidded jars. And the pantry door? Locked. Not with a child latch or something discreet. A full deadbolt, shiny and new. Helen pulled out the small leather notebook she kept tucked inside the blanket draped across her lap. She scribbled, slow, deliberate strokes. Locked. Pantry. New bolt. Amber didn't speak. She simply pulled out her phone and snapped a clear photo, angle, timestamp, all of it. "This okay?" she asked softly. Helen nodded once. Amber hit send. In his office downtown, Samuel Kerr received the photo and tapped twice to zoom. He didn't curse, didn't blink, just picked up the phone with the casual pace of a man placing an order he'd made before. "Tamara," he said when the call connected, "will need original deed access, Garvey estate, safe copy, and the living trust documents." A pause. "Yes, I'm aware of the locked pantry. No, that's not legal." Another pause. "No, Chloe doesn't know I know yet, but she will." He hung up and leaned back in his chair, staring at the framed certificate on the wall. Probate Specialist of the Year, 1994. "This one's going to sing," he murmured to himself. Back in the house, Chloe reappeared in the doorway with a plastic tray. "Dinner," she announced brightly. "We're doing meal prep now. It's easier for everyone." The tray held a single bowl of pureed carrots and what looked like protein mush. No salt, no seasoning, no dignity. Amber stepped forward. "She has dietary preferences." "She has what I approve," Chloe said, sweetly slicing her words like knives. Helen didn't touch the tray. She picked up her pen again. "No choice." Amber read the note, then glanced at Chloe. "I'll make a note for the care file," she said, voice neutral. "Oh, do what you want," Chloe sang, already turning back down the hallway. "We're all family here." As her footsteps faded, Helen turned back to Amber. Her pen scratched again against the paper. "Safe box, closet, left wall." Amber nodded slowly. And then Helen underlined one word: trust. It happened on a Tuesday morning, the kind of clear, brittle day that made the azaleas outside bloom with insultingly perfect color. Amber had just finished adjusting the pillows behind Helen's back. The tray beside her held a pot of early gray, not steeped from a bag, but from the stash Amber had secretly recovered from a bin marked expired toss. One small act of rebellion, one remembered comfort. Footsteps approached, crisp, clipped, and too fast to be casual. "Chloe." She appeared in the doorway holding a clipboard and a smile too bright to be sincere. "Amber," she said, voice light but razor-lined, "I think we're going to make some changes." Amber straightened but didn't step back. "We're downsizing help," Chloe continued. "With the new systems in place, we just don't need as much oversight. I'll take it from here." Helen's hand paused mid-sip. Amber's voice was steady. "With respect, Mrs. Garvey's care isn't up for your management." There was silence. Then Chloe's smile slipped for just a second, like the mask cracked. "She's my mother-in-law." "And I'm her licensed healthcare provider," Amber said. "And unless you're holding medical credentials behind that designer blouse, you don't get to dismiss me." Chloe blinked. The silence snapped. "Well," she said, voice sharpening, "Mark and I will discuss it. In the meantime, I suggest you consider your contract provisional." Amber didn't flinch. She simply turned to Helen. "I'll call Samuel." 2 hours later, Samuel Kerr was in the living room. His briefcase thudded softly against the polished wood coffee table. Mark stood by the window, arms folded, eyes bouncing between Chloe and the floor. Helen sat at the far end of the couch, her hair combed, her back straight, her notebook resting beside her like a co-conspirator. Samuel adjusted his glasses and pulled out a single document. "This," he said, laying it flat, "is an updated healthcare proxy designation. Signed, witnessed, filed." Chloe stepped forward. "You can't—" "I can," Samuel cut in. "And I did." She now speaks through Amber in all matters of health, treatment, and discharge, retroactive and binding. Mark scratched the back of his neck. "Babe, maybe we should let this breathe for a bit." Chloe turned, eyes flashing. "You said we had support." Mark shrugged, awkward. "I didn't think she'd go legal." Samuel smiled without warmth. "You underestimated a woman who helped draft 50 wills, 3 estate cases, and 1 tax fraud prosecution in a single quarter. She's not a beginner." Chloe opened her mouth, but Helen raised her hand. One finger, silence. She turned her wheelchair and rolled slowly down the hallway, her room at the end, soft lamplight leaking under the crack. She entered. Then, click. The lock turned. Downstairs, Chloe stood frozen for a beat before pivoting. Her eyes burned toward the bar cart. She poured herself 2 fingers of something expensive and unnecessary. Mark hovered nearby. "We can still fix this." "We're rebranding," Chloe snapped, already pulling up her phone. "This house is a mess. Dated, sentimental. We bring in a local developer. Clean lines, open space, smart lighting. She'll never keep up." Mark looked uneasy. "You think that'll push her out?" "I think it'll make her irrelevant," Chloe said, "and that's more efficient than a fight." She tapped a contact labeled C. Elliott, Concept Interiors. "We'll start with the foyer," she murmured, pacing now. "Rip out the rug, ditch the wallpaper, replace the family gallery with digital art." Mark shifted again. "But it's her house." Chloe turned to him, sharp. "Not for long." Upstairs, Amber knocked once on Helen's locked door. "I've drafted the care summary," she said softly. "It's in your inbox. We're covered." There was a pause. Then the door opened just an inch, enough for Helen's voice to emerge, quiet, ragged, but firm. "They don't thank help," she said. "They erase it." Amber nodded. "Then we'll make it permanent." Helen didn't reply. She simply pointed toward her nightstand. The envelope there was unsealed. Amber picked it up. Inside, the original trust instructions, annotated in Helen's own hand, with Chloe's name underlined in red and crossed out. Tamara Lou didn't knock. She didn't pause on the porch, didn't straighten her blazer, didn't glance at the blooming camellias curling around the railing like they owned the house. She simply walked in. Samuel was already in the parlor, a neat stack of folders fanned out before him, each one tagged and highlighted like a trial brief. Helen sat beside him, upright in her chair, a legal pad on her lap, one hand steady on the armrest. Amber stood by the mantel, arms folded, watching. Tamara's heels clicked against the wood as she moved toward them. Her presence filled the room like a gavel strike. "I've got it," she said, holding up the final document. "It's done." Samuel adjusted his glasses. "All 4? Lease agreement voided, tenancy revoked, utilities rerouted, And, Tamara added with a smile that didn't touch her eyes, filed with the county clerk. Helen nodded once. Not victory, just confirmation. This was the foundation being set, quiet, unbreakable. Amber passed her a pen. Helen signed the new occupancy contract for herself and Amber with the steadiness of someone who'd waited long enough. Then she slid the folder toward Samuel, who tapped the corner in acknowledgement. Downstairs the front door slammed. Footsteps. Sharp. Familiar. Chloe stormed in wearing gym gear and carrying 2 shopping bags. She paused just inside the entryway, confused by the lights, the quiet, the presence of someone she didn't recognize. Then her key fob hit the floor with a dull plastic thud. She bent to retrieve it, but the front panel on the wall blinked red. Access denied. She tapped it again. Nothing. She looked up. Why can't I? You've been removed from the access list, Tamara said evenly, along with your digital permissions, mail forwarding, and security codes. What? Chloe's voice rose an octave. That's not, no one told me. Samuel stood. I sent notice to your registered email and your P.O. box. As of 9:03 a.m. this morning, you are no longer a legal occupant of this residence. Chloe's eyes darted to Helen, who simply looked back at her. No gloating, no rage, just the full, unsparing clarity of a woman who had taken her power back. I'm Mark's wife, Chloe said, her voice brittle now. You can't just… Actually, Tamara interjected, opening her leather binder, the deed was never in your name. You were listed under conditional tenancy. That's been revoked. You can't kick me out of my own house. Tamara's tone didn't shift. This is her house. You were a guest, now unauthorized. Chloe turned, expecting support, eyes wide, mascara already cracking at the corners. Mark stood at the bottom of the stairs, barefoot, blinking, still groggy from a late night. What is this? He asked weakly. You didn't tell her? Amber asked, arms still crossed. That's awkward. Mark looked from Chloe to Helen, then to the briefcase on the coffee table. Mom, he started, you can't just… Samuel raised one brow. Finish that sentence, son. Mark's mouth opened, then closed again. His shoulders dropped. But where are we supposed to go? Tamara didn't flinch. Your wife doesn't live here anymore. You can stay, with permission. But she? Tamara turned to Chloe. She has 48 hours to remove her belongings. After that, anything left becomes the property of the estate. Silence fell like glass shattering. Chloe laughed once, short and hysterical. This is insane. No, Helen said softly. Her voice barely carried, but the room stilled to hear it. This is legal. And then she turned her chair and rolled out of the room, leaving Chloe standing in the foyer, bags in hand, keys useless, voice caught somewhere between denial and dread. The kitchen looked like a scene from a magazine ad, sleek surfaces, faux warmth, no soul. Chloe moved through it with practiced flair, chopping herbs she didn't know the names of, tossing ingredients like she was still trying to impress a dinner club that had long since stopped inviting her. I'm making cod, she called to Mark, who hovered by the sink pretending to scroll through news alerts. Pan-seared with lemon butter, and that couscous thing your mom used to make, remember? Mark muttered something unintelligible. The oven beeped. Chloe slid the pan in, turned the dial, and checked her reflection in the glass door. Still polished, still together, at least on the surface. Upstairs, laughter drifted down through the air vents. Soft, genuine, dangerously alive. Ruth had arrived just after lunch, bearing homemade peach preserves and a loaf of rosemary bread. She'd kissed Helen on the cheek, whispered, "You're a damn legend," and taken up post by the tea kettle as if she'd never left. Amber had set the table upstairs on the enclosed balcony, where the afternoon light spilled in like blessing. Helen's plate gleamed with buttered steak, roasted potatoes, and sautéed green beans. She cut her own bites, slowly, but with purpose. Ruth raised her glass. To the return of good taste. They clinked, 3 women in a space Chloe thought she'd sterilized. Downstairs, the lights flickered once, then again. Then everything went black. Chloe froze, oven mitt dangling from one hand. Mark, she called, voice clipped, did you forget to pay the power again? No, Mark said, already crossing to the breaker panel. "The lights upstairs are still on, just the kitchen and living area." He opened the panel. Stopped. "What the hell?" Amber appeared in the doorway, arms folded. "Breaker's locked." Chloe spun. "What do you mean locked?" "New box. Tamper-proof. Owner authorization only," Amber replied, nodding to the metal enclosure screwed directly into the wall. A sticker across it read, "Property of Helen Garvey. Modification prohibited. County approved." Chloe's mouth opened. No words came. Mark stepped back. "Did Mom really—" "She did," Amber said. "Legally. Permanently. And the utilities? They're in her name again, including the kitchen circuit." "I have guests coming," Chloe hissed. Amber shrugged. "Then I'd suggest takeout, unless you think DoorDash is beneath you." Chloe stared at her for a long beat, then stormed out of the kitchen. 30 minutes later, the sound of rustling plastic broke the silence. Chloe slammed a greasy takeout bag on the granite counter. $58, she muttered, "for mediocre Thai." Helen's voice floated down the stairs. Not loud, not sharp, just clear. "That'll come out of your repayment." Chloe looked up. Amber was standing at the top of the landing. Behind her, Helen was sipping chamomile from a porcelain cup Ruth had unearthed from the back of a forgotten china cabinet. Mark stared at his wife. "What repayment?" Amber answered. "The one for 16 months of unauthorized withdrawals. Samuel's invoice comes next week." Chloe looked like someone who'd been slapped with paper. No red mark, just the sting. Helen didn't wait for a retort. She wheeled away, back into the golden light of her rebuilt world. The attic smelled like cedar and defiance. Amber cracked open the trunk with a crowbar Ruth had fetched from the garage. Inside, layers of yellowed tissue and old velvet wrapped the bones of a forgotten legacy. Certificates, photographs, and tarnished brass, kept safe in the dark too long. Helen sat nearby in her chair, wrapped in a shawl older than Chloe's marriage. She nodded toward the base of the trunk. "That's the one," she said softly. Amber reached in and pulled it out. A brass nameplate, engraved, edges dulled but still proud. "Garvey House, 1963. Beneath it, wrapped in oilskin, were the framed black-and-white photos Chloe had stripped from the foyer. Helen's wedding portrait, the groundbreaking of the estate, a signed commendation from the mayor's office, and one picture of a much younger Samuel standing beside Helen and her late husband. Champagne glasses raised in a moment that hadn't known what was coming. Chloe had boxed them up months ago, called it refreshing the space. Helen called it something else. Erasure. Downstairs, the foyer echoed with its own emptiness. Bland wallpaper, a digital canvas stuck in slideshow mode, flickering between drone footage and stock landscapes. Amber carried the first frame down and held it up. "Here?" she asked. Helen nodded. "Right where she tore it down." Ruth followed with the second, already dusted and rematted. One by one, they reassembled the past, not as sentiment, but as evidence. Proof that this house was never Chloe's playground. It was a home, a history, a fortress with deep foundations. Mark came down halfway through the process, shirt wrinkled, hair still damp. He watched from the stairs, silent. Amber adjusted the final photo, then stepped back to check the symmetry. Helen rolled up beside her and lifted the brass nameplate in both hands. Ruth held out the drill. "I can do it," Helen said. Amber hesitated. "Are you sure?" "I was born sure." The bit whirred, sharp and slow. When it was done, Helen wiped the plate with her sleeve and stepped back. It gleamed. Ruth exhaled. "Well, I'll be damned." Mark finally spoke. Quiet, almost to himself. "She's really doing this." Ruth didn't turn to him, just murmured, "She's doing it right." Upstairs in Helen's study, Samuel was on the phone. "Yes, file it now," he said. "No, not under Garvey, under Wallace. Her maiden name, it's an original land inheritance, predates the marriage. Yes, I have the deed." He clicked to send a scan and waited. "Confirmed," the clerk said. "County records updated. New title issued by Monday." He hung up and turned toward the window, watching the sun settle on the nameplate below. Later that evening, Mark stood alone in the foyer. The hallway lights glowed soft amber, catching the grain of the oak floor Helen had fought to preserve. The nameplate stared back at him from its new rightful place. Garvey House, 1963. His mother's house, his father's work, and now his wife's exit route. He reached out to touch one of the photo frames. His hand hovered, uncertain. Behind him, Helen's voice broke the silence. She let go of this house the day she tried to erase me. Mark turned. Helen sat at the base of the stairs, eyes calm, hands folded in her lap. She was never going to stay, she added. But you still have time to decide who you are. He looked down, said nothing, then walked away. The garden had not bloomed this freely in years. Somewhere between the camellias and the hydrangeas, the house had remembered it belonged to someone who once loved it with intention. Helen sat at the center of it all beneath a canvas umbrella, the shade casting gentle shadows over her hands, which rested calmly on the arms of her chair. Her shawl was pale ivory today, light enough for summer, but lined with the lace edging her mother had stitched by hand in 1949. It was the sort of garment Chloe would have called dated, but to Helen it was armor stitched from memory. Amber moved with quiet precision, setting plates across the linen-covered table. Ruth, cheeks flushed from the warmth, poured sweet tea from a glass pitcher into heavy tumblers that clinked with ice. Across from her sat Tamara, in pressed slacks and a wide-brimmed hat, listening with sincere interest as Helen's old co-worker Gloria recounted a story about misfiled court transcripts and a judge with no patience. Linda, who hadn't set foot in the house since Helen's stroke, sat beside them both with a napkin draped over her lap and laughter tucked into the corners of her eyes. The table had been set with care, not ostentatious but deliberate, real china, proper silverware, no paper plates or branded napkins. There was a bowl of Ruth's famous peach preserves in the center, still warm, and a pitcher of lemon water garnished with herbs clipped fresh from Helen's own garden beds. The smell of rosemary and fresh biscuits floated on the air, mingling with something less tangible. Peace, perhaps, or reclamation. Inside the house, behind the heavy front windows, Chloe watched them. She hadn't been invited. That truth settled like dust along her collarbone. She stood barefoot in the kitchen, the cheap robe slung around her frame, fingers clenched around a mug that had long gone cold. From her vantage point, she could see Helen seated confidently in the garden, lifting a fork to her lips as Amber refilled her glass with ease. The sight made Chloe's stomach churn. Not because of the meal, but because of the meaning. These weren't just brunch guests. They were witnesses. The invitation had gone out the week prior, handwritten on cream cardstock, each one sealed in gold wax and delivered by hand or mail, depending on the distance. Chloe had found the leftover envelope remnants in the wastebasket 2 days ago and pretended not to notice. There was no text, no online RSVP, no opportunity to intercept. She had not even been a rumor in its planning. Now she was a ghost in her own kitchen. Outside, the laughter rose again, louder this time. Helen leaned slightly forward and touched Amber's arm, motioning toward the center of the table. The conversation softened as she stood with help from her walker. Her movements were slow, careful, but there was no mistaking the clarity in her spine or the intent in her eyes. "I want to say something," she said gently, and the group around her hushed in instant deference. "I have lived in this house for over 50 years. I've watched seasons shift, birthdays pass, people come and go. Some left without saying goodbye, others left after saying things they can't take back." Her voice didn't crack. If anything, it sharpened, steadied. "But some of you stayed, or you came back. And when I needed someone to remind me I still mattered, you did it without a second thought. So today isn't about the garden or the food. It's about gratitude, and about honoring the people who never turned away." There was no applause, only raised glasses, the clink of glass against glass, and the sound of Ruth whispering, "To Helen," before others echoed it in low, reverent tones. Back inside, Chloe lowered the mug and pulled out her phone. Her fingers tapped furiously against the screen as she dialed. Mark answered on the third ring. "She's having a sympathy parade," Chloe hissed. "In the garden, with tea, toasts, guests. It's disgusting." There was a long pause on the other end. When Mark finally spoke, his voice was low. "Is it sympathy?" he asked. "Or did we just underestimate her?" Chloe didn't respond right away. She watched through the glass as Helen sat down again, surrounded by a circle of strength she hadn't needed to buy. Ruth placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Amber poured more tea. Out came Samuel, fashionably late but smiling as he adjusted his tie and took a seat with no fanfare, no performance, just belonging. And then Amber, with the ease of someone who knew the angles, lifted her phone and pressed record. Helen didn't blink. She turned toward the lens, lifted her glass once more, and said only, "To starting over." It was a Wednesday afternoon when the patrol car pulled into the gravel circle out front. The sun hung directly overhead, casting long, hard shadows across the porch and driveway. The air buzzed with cicadas, and somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower droned on like background static. Inside, Helen sat in the front parlor, sipping mint tea with Amber and Ruth. The curtains had been pulled open wide. Nothing to hide. Nothing left to prove. Through the open window, the slow crunch of boots on gravel reached them. Amber stood and walked to the front door, pausing just long enough to glance back at Helen, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Outside, the officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a neatly pressed uniform and mirrored sunglasses, walked up the steps holding a folded document sealed in an official envelope. He knocked once, firmly. Chloe opened the door halfway, still wearing the same robe she'd barely changed out of all week. She squinted at the uniform, then instinctively stepped forward, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Yes?" she asked, her voice already sharp with suspicion. "Ma'am," the officer said with practiced calm, "I'm here on behalf of Ms. Helen Wallace Garvey, legal occupant and owner of this residence. I have official documentation for service." He held out the envelope. Chloe didn't take it. "Excuse me?" she snapped. "This is my house. You can't just show up and—" "Actually," the officer interrupted, "you've been served. Please refrain from interfering with a legal order. This is an official eviction notice. You have 48 hours to vacate, or you will be removed by court enforcement." Chloe's face twisted. "This is elder abuse," she shouted, loud enough for the whole street to hear. "She's senile. She's being manipulated. You're siding with a woman who can't even walk straight." The officer didn't blink. "She's the victim, ma'am." A beat passed, then another. And just as Chloe opened her mouth again, Amber stepped outside, her phone already filming. "On her behalf," she said, "I have full medical and legal proxy. She's asked that this interaction be documented for her records." The officer gave a nod. "Completely within her rights." Amber's camera held steady. Chloe's voice cracked now. "You're filming me? This is harassment. I will sue—" "You can try," Amber replied, tone even, "but I wouldn't recommend it. She has better lawyers." Chloe looked between them, the uniform and the camera, and for the first time her certainty faltered. Her shoulders dropped. Her hand clenched at the edge of the doorframe like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Inside the house, Helen listened. The tea had cooled in her cup, but her gaze remained fixed on the porch through the open curtains. She didn't need to stand to feel the weight of what was happening. For the first time in months, the house felt aligned with her. Not haunted, not stolen, Heron. By that evening, the footage was uploaded. Brief, clear, undeniable. Amber trimmed it carefully, included the officer's statement, Chloe's reaction, and the date stamped across the top corner. She didn't add music or commentary. She didn't need to. Within hours, the video had been picked up by a local legal rights forum, then a caregiver advocacy page. Then it started circulating in private Facebook groups for women over 50, those who'd seen the same kind of cruelty dressed up as concern, the same manipulation hiding behind help. The comments rolled in fast. "Good for her. About time. My daughter-in-law tried something like this. I lost everything. God bless that nurse. We need more like her." By nightfall, the story had taken on a shape of its own. Helen didn't need to explain herself. The world was already filling in the blanks, with empathy, with outrage, and with truth. In the guest room upstairs, Mark sat on the edge of the bed, suitcase open, half-packed. Chloe stood by the closet, arms folded tightly, a small pile of clothes at her feet. She went public, Chloe said bitterly. She actually broadcast it. Mark didn't answer. She humiliated me. He finally looked at her. No, he said quietly. You did that yourself. The town hall building sat square in the center of Main Street, flanked by two aging magnolias and a rusting Civil War monument that had recently become a source of quiet debate. Inside, the chairs in the community meeting room had been rearranged into two neat rows facing a long oak dais where the town board members sat with folded hands and weary expressions. The room smelled faintly of paper, air conditioning, and old wood polish, the scent of decisions made and unmade for decades. Helen arrived 10 minutes early, seated in her chair with Amber to one side and Samuel Kerr to the other. She wore navy wool trimmed in ivory, no scarf, no embellishment, just dignity. The nameplate on her lapel read simply, Helen W. Garvey, resident. Chloe was already there, seated near the back with a man in a blazer too tight at the elbows and loafers that still had price tags inside. He whispered something to her, tapping a clipboard against his knee with nervous urgency. Her arms were crossed, her lips pursed. Her entire posture was that of a woman on the verge of either a tantrum or an implosion. Samuel adjusted his cufflinks, pulled out a folder from his briefcase, and nodded once toward Helen. She nodded back. The board called the session to order. As the next matter on today's docket, the chairwoman announced, we'll hear from Ms. Helen Wallace Garvey regarding occupancy rights and recent challenges to her estate title. Samuel stood. He didn't clear his throat or pace. He simply stepped forward with the poise of a man who had waited for this moment, not with vengeance, but with precision. He opened the folder. Good afternoon, members of the board, he began. My name is Samuel Kerr. I appear today on behalf of Ms. Helen Wallace Garvey, lifelong resident of Greenville, retired legal secretary of 42 years, and rightful owner of the property in question, known historically and now legally as Garvey House, built 1963, titled originally under her family's name. There were no objections. He continued, his voice unwavering. In recent months, Ms. Garvey has been subjected to psychological manipulation, unlawful occupancy by individuals not named on the deed, financial exploitation, and medical neglect. She was confined to a single floor of her own home, denied access to food, funds, and freedom of movement. Her pantry was locked, her care restricted, her name removed from utility accounts without consent. Chloe shifted in her seat, the movement stiff and sharp. The realtor beside her stared straight ahead. Samuel didn't stop. These actions, orchestrated primarily by one Chloe Garvey, who sits here today with yet another representative looking to flip the property for personal gain, constitute a breach of familial trust, tenant law, and basic human decency. He paused, let the silence land, then continued, softer now. What Ms. Garvey seeks today is not revenge, it is recognition. A formal declaration from this board that she retains full occupancy rights, protective status from future dispute, and public acknowledgement of her standing as the sole legal resident and title holder of Garvey House. He closed the folder. And that the record reflect, she was never the problem. A murmur passed through the room, the kind that happens when truth is laid bare and no one can unhear it. The board chairwoman looked over the documents that had already been submitted. She glanced at the county clerk's confirmation, then at Helen, seated quietly with her hands folded, watching Chloe without blinking. Not angry, just done. The chairwoman nodded. The board accepts the documentation and affirms Ms. Garvey's request. Effective immediately, Ms. Garvey holds lifelong protective occupancy status for her residence and property. No challenges will be accepted going forward. A gavel tapped once, lightly, almost like punctuation. Chloe didn't speak. She stood, straightened her blazer, and walked out of the room without saying a word. The door closed behind her with a soft thud. Samuel looked at Helen. Would you like to say anything for the record? Helen turned toward the board. Her voice, when it came, was low but steady. Let the record show, she said. I'm still here. The office at Greenville Public Utilities hadn't changed in decades. Beige linoleum curled at the corners. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow on laminated flyers about storm safety and seasonal billing plans. Behind the plexiglass window, a woman named Tanya, 59, unflappable and armed with a keyboard she knew like a piano, adjusted her glasses as she looked down at the screen. "So," she said, tapping a few keys, "your name was removed from the water and electric accounts on January 12th of last year." Helen sat calmly across from her, hands folded in her lap, shoulders relaxed beneath a soft, slate-blue cardigan. Amber stood to her right, legal documents neatly arranged in a leather portfolio. Ruth had driven and was parked out front, knitting and listening to old jazz on the car stereo. Helen tilted her head, just slightly. "Removed without consent? That's what it looks like," Tanya said. "Rerouted under a Chloe Garvey. Same service address, same meter readings, but different logins. No authorization request on file, no power of attorney on record." Amber spoke next, sliding 2 notarized forms under the plexiglass. "We're requesting immediate restoration of name and access, with full backdating to the day of removal. This includes penalties incurred under fraudulent access codes." Tanya looked at the forms, let out a slow whistle, and nodded. "Don't get many of these," she murmured, typing faster now. "But when we do, it's usually because someone finally decided they were tired of being treated like a guest in their own home." Helen didn't smile. She didn't need to. 40 minutes later, every account, water, electric, waste, and gas, had been restored in her name. She declined paperless billing. She wanted the records mailed, physically, to the address listed on the deed. Before they left, Tanya printed one final page and passed it through the tray. "This," she said, "is for your records." It was a statement of reversal. At the bottom, a red stamp read, "Fine issued, unauthorized transfer, $928.72. Helen tapped the paper once with her index finger, then looked at Amber. "That's about the cost of that smart fridge she insisted on," she said. "Fitting." That afternoon, installation began. A private technician hired by Samuel arrived just after lunch, carrying a box of equipment labeled Guardian Home Network. Within 2 hours, the house had a new system: motion sensors, temperature monitors, smart locks, voice alerts, and a discrete control panel installed directly beside Helen's bedroom doorway. Amber and Ruth received access codes, biometric clearance, and remote logins. Chloe did not. Neither did Mark. Helen tested the thermostat first. 72, she said aloud. "The new standard." The panel lit up green, and the air conditioning hummed to life. Later, Amber found Chloe's old login still trying to access the utility hub from a mobile device. The system flagged the attempt, blocked it, and auto-forwarded the report to Helen's private account. Chloe, now 2 towns away in a rented townhouse with weak Wi-Fi and no view, received a letter 2 days later. It was from Greenville Collections Bureau. She had 30 days to pay the outstanding utilities balance from the previous residence. Failure to comply would result in a lien being placed against any jointly held assets with Mark. When she called to contest the charge, Tanya transferred her to a voicemail titled "Unauthorized User Appeals, Limited Success Expected." Helen heard about it from Ruth later that day. She didn't laugh, but she did allow herself one satisfied sip of mint tea, followed by a rare indulgence: a slice of lemon pie at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Amber joined her in the sunroom as the last rays of light painted long gold lines across the floorboards. "The house is quiet," Amber said. Helen nodded. "Funny," she replied, "how quiet it gets when power's in the right hands." The guest room door swung open to reveal a scene of carefully curated welcome. Freshly ironed sheets, a soft quilt folded at the foot of the bed, pillows plumped just so, and a small desk with a crisp notepad and an envelope bearing Helen's handwriting. The afternoon sun filtered through sheer curtains, casting warm patterns across the polished hardwood floor. Chloe stood in the doorway, clutching 2 boxes of her belongings. Tamara Lou accompanied her, professional, composed, every inch the notary who held the power that day. Behind them was the hallway, quiet and unwelcoming. Helen sat in an armchair at the end of the bed. Ruth stood beside her, holding a plate of cookies. They both watched Chloe with calm composure, as though expecting her arrival on their terms. Chloe's lips twisted as she surveyed the room, recognition dawning. This was never hers. Not truly. "This is my house," she hissed, voice low and raw. She set one box on the bed and took a sharp breath. "I lived here." Helen raised an eyebrow, but her voice remained soft. "And that's the door." Chloe's face flushed. She bent to pick up one of the boxes, clutched at the edge of the desk. She glanced at the key placed in plain view. "I just need my things," she spat, stepping forward. "That's all." Amber appeared just beside the bed, silent and steady. Chloe looked at her, then at Tamara. They were authority incarnate now. With trembling hands, Chloe grabbed a few remaining items: framed photographs, a vase, a purse that seemed too large to escape from. She didn't touch the quilt. She didn't sit. She didn't speak. Helen watched, utterly still. Ruth brushed back a stray curl from Chloe's face, as if offering kindness to someone who had forgotten how to receive it. Chloe turned toward the door, shoulders squared, one box in each hand. Ruth opened it quietly. Chloe shoved past her, nearly bumping into Tamara, who simply stepped aside. As she reached the threshold, Chloe paused. She swirled around and glared at Helen, eyes glistening with unshed tears and defiance. "You didn't need me," she said, voice catching. "You've erased me." Helen remained seated, quiet, but she allowed herself a single breath. "I never needed erasing." Chloe stormed out, boxes banged, slamming past the frame. Tamara followed, then closed the door behind them. Amber moved to the outside of the door and turned the knob. It clicked into place. The lock slid home. She eased the door and slid the extra key into Helen's hand. Helen took it, fingers curling around metal with more strength than Chloe had ever known existed there. She placed the key into a small wooden box on the desk beside her. Ruth retrieved the vase of cookies and placed it on the bedside table. "What happens now?" Ruth asked quietly, not looking at Helen but at the door. Helen stood, shuffling over to the window, and watched the quiet hallway. "Now," she said softly, "the house can finally breathe." In Samuel Kerr's oak-paneled office, curtains were drawn to soften midday sunlight into a golden half-light that felt both warm and solemn. Helen sat in a leather armchair, flanked by Amber on her left and Ruth on her right. Samuel sat across a polished mahogany desk, several official-looking documents arrayed before him in orderly precision. He cleared his throat softly. "Ms. Garvey," he began, voice steady, "this is the amended trust document. It removes all claims, financial, residential, and medical, for Chloe Garvey, Mark Garvey, and any descendants thereof. Their rights to the estate are permanently rescinded." Helen's fingers folded over each other in her lap. She looked at Amber, then at Ruth, then back at Samuel, who offered a gentle nod. She understood what it meant. These papers were the final layer of protection, the legal sealing of her domain. Samuel slid the pen across the desk toward her. The nib glinted in the filtered light. When Helen took it, the paper slipped beneath her palms like invitation. She signed, her handwriting firm, determined, each stroke of ink a statement. Amber signed next, followed by Ruth, their names echoing consent and loyalty. Samuel lifted the signed sheets and slid them neatly into a sealed envelope. "Filed," he said, "notarized, witnessed, delivered to the probate court." He pressed an extra copy into Helen's lap wrapped in parchment stock. "For your records?" At home later, as dusk began to soften windows into smoky glass, the three women gathered in the sunroom. Helen held the parchment on her lap like a talisman. Amber poured tea from a pink porcelain pot passed down from Helen's mother, and Ruth sliced a lemon cake that still smelled of late summer quince. Helen looked up. "I've named you both my medical and legal proxies," she said, voice steady but soft. Amber's eyes glistened. Ruth reached across and took Helen's hand, squeezing it just so. That night, Mark called. Helen answered on the first ring. His voice cracked. "Mom, I don't know what to say." Helen sat upright. She felt a mixing of sorrow and resolve. "She broke us, Mark," she said calmly. "You let her." He inhaled sharply. I thought I was trying to keep you safe." Helen closed her eyes for a moment. pressing her finger against the wrist of the woman who had forgotten how to fight. "You forgot who you were part of," she replied. He swallowed. "I'm sorry." She didn't say anything more. The connection ended with quiet finality. 2 days later, Chloe submitted one more appeal, this time through county filings and legal counsel. Comments accompanied her motion: her marriage, her prior tenancy status, her future intentions. The clerk's office returned it before lunch. Denied, no appeal, no further recourse. Chloe's name would never again appear on record tied to the estate, the house, or the land. In the living room, Samuel placed the final stamped rejection notice in Helen's hands. It carried an official seal and the words, "Appeal rejected. Trust amendment binding." Helen studied the page beneath the seal, then looked up at Amber and Ruth. She exhaled, quiet, full. She turned the page. On the desk lay a pristine new document, estate executor certificate. Her name listed alone, no contingencies, no disclaimers. She picked up the pen again and signed. The click of the cap echoed softly in the hush of the room. She set it down. Samuel collected the document. And then Helen sat back. The room felt lighter. Her breath measured. The ink dried. It was done. The garden glistened in the gold of early evening, the sun just low enough to soften the lines of everything it touched. Helen walked slowly between rows of marigolds and rosemary, her left hand resting gently in the crook of Amber's arm. She moved with careful precision, each step measured, deliberate, but undeniably her own. The soil beneath their feet had been turned last week. Ruth had helped replant the basil. Amber built the small trellis for the climbing beans. And Helen, from the wrought iron bench by the camellias, had directed it all, not bossy, not fragile. Just firm, present. Now the rosemary brushed against her skirt as they passed, releasing its scent in tiny bursts. "The porch needs sanding," Helen said quietly, her eyes following a hairline crack in one of the flagstones. Amber smiled. "We'll take care of it." Ahead, the steps creaked just a little, a sound that once would have made Chloe wrinkle her nose, but today it felt real. Like the house breathing in sync with its owner again. On the porch, Ruth emerged holding a glass pie dish wrapped in a thick towel. Peach cobbler, the crust golden, imperfect, dusted with coarse sugar and still warm at the edges. "Give it 20 minutes or you'll burn your tongues," she said, setting it on the table between them. "Risk worth taking," Amber replied. They settled into their usual spots, Amber in the rocker, Helen in the cushioned chair with the high arms, Ruth at the table, peeling a single orange like it was a ritual. The porch was quiet, not empty. Just quiet. Inside, after the cobbler cooled and the light thinned further, Helen moved to her writing desk. A large manila folder rested in the center, tied with a navy ribbon. She untied it, gently, and opened it. Inside, her full estate plan. Finalized, stamped, indexed, every page meticulously arranged, property, accounts, end-of-life care, charitable disbursements, the transfer of the land into a local preservation trust. There were no gaps, no loose ends, no names left dangling that didn't belong. She ran her finger over the final page, a simple line of bold print. Executor, Helen Wallace Garvey, not widow, not mother, not in-law, just Helen, whole, enough. Her eyes lifted to the bookshelf beside her desk. Nestled between an old poetry collection and a framed black and white photo of her and her late husband was a new edition, the picture Amber had printed from the eviction footage. Helen, seated calmly on the porch, her chin high, the officer at her side, Chloe mid-scream in the background, frozen in digital fury. Below the photo, the brass plate read, "Not the day I was broken. The day I was counted." She stared at it for a moment, then closed the estate folder and placed it in the drawer beneath the desk. Later that evening, Amber returned from the mailbox with a stack of envelopes bound by a thin rubber band. She flipped through them absently. Utility statements, a gardening catalog, a fundraiser flyer for the animal shelter. Then she paused. A pale blue envelope, hand-addressed, no return address, no logo. She handed it to Helen. Helen opened it slowly, sliding one finger under the flap. Inside was a card, plain white, embossed with a soft watercolor of the town's community center. The message inside was written in careful cursive: "We watched, we heard, we know. You're an inspiration, Ms. Garvey. Thank you for reminding us what dignity looks like." Signed, Greenville Women's Support Circle. Helen exhaled, not quite a sigh, something softer, deeper. She passed the card to Amber, who read it twice, then set it down gently beside the vase of lilies Ruth had arranged that morning. "They thought I had no one," Helen said finally, her voice not bitter, but awed. "But I had myself, and enough truth for witnesses." Amber looked at her. "You had more than that," she whispered. "You had us." Helen smiled. But before she could speak again, a knock came from the front door. 3 firm raps. The women turned, the house holding its breath for what came next. The morning sun rose slow and deliberate, stretching golden light across the side wall of the house like a slow caress. Helen sat on the porch in her usual chair, a pale blue shawl wrapped over her shoulders, a china teacup resting neatly in her palm. The steam curled up toward her cheek, brushing her skin like a memory. From where she sat, she could see the brass nameplate mounted just beneath the edge of the front window. Garvey House, 1963. It gleamed, more than metal, more than a sign. It was declaration, history, the thing no one could take. Amber had polished it that morning, crouched in the early chill with a cloth and lemon oil, humming something low and contented. She hadn't needed to ask. She just did it, like brushing someone's hair or setting a table for someone who mattered. Helen sipped her tea and watched as the trees across the property line swayed in gentle unison. There was no wind, just that peculiar kind of stillness that made you want to hold your breath and listen. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out, then another. The house remained quiet, peaceful, not heavy. Inside, fresh flowers stood in the hallway vase, lilies and lavender Ruth had cut that morning from the side garden. The air held the scent of lemonwood polish and linen. Amber had changed the guest bed sheets again, though no one had used them. She said it mattered that they stayed ready, that nothing in the house should fall still again. On the mantel above the fireplace, the eviction day photo had been joined by another, this one newer. It showed Helen standing, one hand on her walker, the other raised slightly in toast, the garden blooming behind her. Her eyes were bright, her smile calm, her spine straight. The thermostat clicked softly. Amber appeared in the doorway holding her phone. "Set to 72, she said. Helen laughed, a real one, warm and unguarded. "The new standard," she said, the words wrapped in something more than humor, something like joy. Amber smiled and stepped back inside, letting the screen door close gently behind her. The porch creaked just once as Helen shifted her weight and crossed one leg over the other. A breeze touched the edge of her shawl and fluttered the pages of the book on the table beside her. On her phone, a single notification blinked. "Missed call, Chloe, blocked." Helen tapped the screen once. Block confirmed. Another ping. "Missed call, Mark, blocked." She closed the phone with a quiet flick and set it face down beside her tea. That chapter 2 had ended. No more pleas, no more regrets, no more asking permission in her own home. From the edge of the lawn, the sound of a mechanical whir broke the silence. A moment later, the front gate clicked into place. A soft beep followed. A new code accepted, old entries erased. Permanently. Amber had installed it 2 days ago with the same technician who'd secured the smart locks and motion lights. She said it was more than a gate, it was punctuation. Helen agreed. She leaned her head back against the chair and stared up into the sky. Clouds passed slowly above, their bellies thick with the promise of late summer rain. Behind her, the house breathed quietly. No raised voices, no slammed doors, no withheld keys or locked cabinets. Just presence. Just peace. A breeze swept through the porch again, lifting the hem of her shawl and carrying it upward, like a sigh let go after too long held tight. Helen reached for her cup once more, then paused. Her eyes flicked toward the nameplate, toward the porch steps, toward the gate now sealed. She smiled, and she said, not to Amber or Ruth or anyone else, but simply to the air, to the moment itself. She said I had no one, but I had enough witnesses to end her, legally, publicly, and without ever raising my voice.